Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library. In fact, thank you so much for coming out through this amazing weather, I'll call it that. And thank you so much to Literati Bookstore for always bringing us such wonderful events. And we're really excited to host this event this evening with Reece Jones. It's just to very, very briefly introduce Reece Jones as a Guggenheim Fellow. He is professor and chair of the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawaii. And he's being joined in conversation this evening by Phil Chrisman, who teaches English at the University of Michigan. And we will have a conversation between the two of them, a Q&A, and then Reece will sign books at this table. Literati's outside in the foyer area. If you didn't see them, they're selling books, and you can grab a book after the event if you haven't grabbed one already. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Phil. Thank you so much.
Okay, can you all hear me okay? All right, well, so welcome to the event, and thanks to Reece Jones for traveling, my God, all the way from Honolulu. I'm assuming that we're not the only, I hope we're not the only stop on the tour. Nobody's protected: how the Border Patrol became the most dangerous police force in the United States is a fascinating, well-written, very frightening and dystopian look into the Border Patrol as an institution that both worsens and also characterizes and embodies some of the worst qualities of the quasi-police state that we live in. These are issues that I care about and that I thought I was paying a lot of attention to, and I learned a lot from this book. If you have any interest in sort of the carceral state or anti-racism or any related topics, absolutely worth the money. So I'm going to start with a question that I often ask people who are working in interesting fields. Since you've gotten into researching Border Patrol and the way the border works, what are the things that you've learned that tend to be most surprising to people who are sort of civilians, who are non-experts on these issues?
Yeah, well, thanks, Phil, for being here and joining me for this event, and thanks to Literati Books for hosting it, and the Ann Arbor District Library, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this terrible weather day. I appreciate the dedication. I suspect a lot of people turned back with the downed trees and lightning and rain. I almost turned back myself, so thank you for your dedication in being here. And why am I here? My daughter is actually a freshman at Michigan State University, so I'm dropping her off. So
I take back everything I said.
Yeah. So I was happy to stop in here as well on the way back through. Most surprising thing, I think the thing that catches the most people by surprise is quite how far inside the United States the Border Patrol can operate. When people think of the border, the images that come to mind are the deserts of Arizona, or the Trump's wall that's going up in California and Texas, places like that. They don't think about the border is operating inside the United States to the extent that it does. So they're really surprised to find out that the border zone is from 100 miles of borders and coastlines. So it's a vast area into the interior of the United States where the Border Patrol can operate. So if you think about that, so 100 miles from borders and coastlines, about 2/3 of the US population lives in that border zone. A number of the largest cities in the United States are in that border zone. And often some that people think of as close to the border, like, for example, Dallas or Phoenix, they're not in the border zone. But other cities like Los Angeles, Houston, but then also Miami, New York, Washington, Detroit, makes sense. But yeah, also the entire state of Michigan is in the border zone, right? So there's nowhere in this state where the Border Patrol can't operate. And they do operate here. Same thing where I live in Hawaii. There's nowhere in the state that's more than 100 miles from a coastline. So the entire state is the border zone. So you're probably thinking in your mind, wait a second, Michigan, Lake Michigan, that's not an international border, right? But the Border Patrol considers Lake Michigan an international waterway. And so because of that, they mark their zone from all of those coastlines. So all into Wisconsin and Illinois as well from Lake Michigan. Okay, what does that matter, right? What is the consequence of having this 100-mile border zone? Well, as I talk about in the book, the Border Patrol has a series of exceptions to the Constitution of the United States that allows them to make stops in this border zone that regular police cannot do. And so the stories I tell in the book is how this came to be. What were the cases at the Supreme Court where this kind of expansive authority of the Border Patrol was adjudicated? And then what are the consequences of that in the lives of people today in this vast border zone? So yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and we can...
Yeah, I mean, there are two places that I kind of immediately want to go from there. I want to talk about those cases because that was a lot of what was new and surprising in the book to me. And I also want to talk about, like, you talk about the Border Patrol being empowered to make stops, to do certain things. I mean, what are some ways that can look, and what are some ways that can really go sideways? What do those exceptions and carve-outs from the Constitution look like? So maybe let's take that second one, and then we'll move back to the first one.
Yeah.
When you say the Border Patrol is empowered to act in certain ways, like, what are we talking about? What are some of the things that they can do and shouldn't be able to do?
Yeah. So, of course, the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution says that citizens and immigrants, everyone in the United States, is protected from unreasonable searches and seizures inside the country. But the original authorization for the Border Patrol, and then when it was reviewed at the Supreme Court in the 1970s, they created a number of carve-outs to that where the Border Patrol doesn't have to abide by the same rules as regular police do. And this is most evident in two areas. The first is the Border Patrol has a much lower standard of evidence in order to stop a vehicle in that 100-mile border zone. So regular police need probable cause to stop a vehicle and pull someone over, whereas the Border Patrol just needs reasonable suspicion. And so the Supreme Court, in adjudicating this, came up with a list of what they call articulable facts, so reasons why the Border Patrol could pull somebody over in the border zone. And one of the key cases was about race specifically, and could they stop someone just based on their race? And we can talk in detail about that case, but they eventually decided that no, they can't stop someone just based on race. But they go on to create a list of why they can stop someone. And the case from 1975, it's Brignon Ponce versus the United States, includes a wide range of reasons that are articulable facts. And what's remarkable about it is that they include characteristics of the area in addition to things specific to that vehicle. So they don't have to have particular suspicion about a vehicle. Instead, it can be facts about the area generally, including things like an area known for smuggling, a road previously used by smugglers, types of vehicles. It mentions station wagons specifically. It mentions overloaded vehicles. It mentions dirty vehicles. And then it goes on to say that they can use race as well as one of the characteristics. So they can't use race as the only reason to stop a car. They can't say the driver looked Mexican, I'm going to pull that car over and ask questions. But they can say the driver looked Mexican and they're driving on a road known for smuggling, I'm going to pull that car over. Right, and that is the Supreme Court authorized that in the 1970s. They went further in the 2000s as well. 2014, The Justice Department reviewed that and approved it as well. So it's something, and that was during the Obama administration. The second thing that they can do in this zone, so with those articulable facts, they can stop virtually any vehicle because the types of facts that they can come up with are really broad. There was a review actually here in Michigan. The ACLU of Michigan looked at the Border Patrol's data for like a 3-year period, and they released a report about 2 years ago looking at that. So they were looking at 2015, 16, 17 data of what the Border Patrol reported for why they stopped someone here in Michigan. And in that, you can just see how they can justify any stop, right? So in one report, they would say that the driver wouldn't look at me, and that was really suspicious because they kept averting their gaze and wouldn't look at my vehicle, and so I pulled them over because of that suspicious behavior. The next report says the driver kept staring at me, and that was really suspicious, and so because of that, I pulled them over and checked on their vehicle, right? So virtually any reason can be justified for the Border Patrol to make a stop.
When we were talking about, articulable facts, and you mentioned like a road that is known for smuggling, I thought, so if I'm a Border Patrol officer, to me every road in the world is just suddenly known for smuggling. It seems like none of a lot of those are things that might not be subject to very rigorous definition.
Yeah, absolutely, right? I mean, you could say if there's been one vehicle that had a smuggler on that road in the past, okay, I know that that vehicle was there, and it could be justified. And in fact, the first of those 14 facts is actually a border road, right? So if you think about the definition of the border is 100 miles from borders and coastlines, it is by definition a border road where the Border Patrol is operating, right? So you could say they essentially have fact number one already in place, right? And so it needs to just be one thing in addition to that. But yeah, it's a really broad definition, and the result has been they can stop any vehicle that they want to in that border zone. I've experienced that myself. In fact, the reason that I started to work on this book was a decade ago. I was on a road in Texas with a rancher. This was when I was working on my first book, which was about border walls, and I was going to look at a section of the border wall in Texas near this rancher's land. And we were on a public Texas road. It was a gravel road leading to the border, but it was a public road. And in a 1-hour period, while we were driving to his land and then coming back, we were pulled over by the Border Patrol 5 times in 1 hour. For simply driving on a road near the border. And at the time, I was shocked because I couldn't believe that the Border Patrol could really stop a vehicle 5 times in less than an hour without any real reason for stopping that vehicle. And so I was like, I need to go figure out how they can do this. What is the justification for that? And it turned out it was within their authorization in order to do that. And so that's how I started working on this project, to tell the stories of how this came to be.
Yeah, one of the claims in the book that jumped out at me, because it described as a goal of the book one of the impacts that the book did have on me. You said that you wanted people to read the book and to feel that the cases, one of them you already mentioned, Borgnoni Ponce versus U.S.
Yep.
And then Martinez
Fuerte.
Yes. You said you wanted sort of the same sort of recoil that we feel inside when we hear Plessy versus Ferguson or Korematsu or maybe now Dodd. You want us to kind of have the same reaction when we hear of those cases. You want those cases to be as famously bad as those cases. Tell us a little bit about those 2 cases and why they're terrible.
Yeah, I think it's surprising to me that more people aren't aware of these particular cases, because they were 2 cases in the 1970s, 1975 and 1976, where the Supreme Court considered whether the Border Patrol could do racial profiling. Is that something that's allowed under the Constitution? And in both cases, they came down with an answer that yes, that the Border Patrol in this border zone, which is an area where 2/3 of the American population lives, the Border Patrol can use the race of an individual in the policing that they're doing, which to me is an outrageous concept and something that I think flies in the face of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bans discrimination based on a whole series of characteristics, but also just equal protection clause as well in the Constitution. But they're unknown, right? The Brignone Ponce, that term has only appeared in the New York Times once in the entire history of the paper of record in the United States, right? And it was a report the day after that case was heard by the Supreme Court. One of the goals for this book is to bring these cases to a broader knowledge and make people aware that these are still on the books, right? I mean, when we think about Plessy versus Ferguson or Korematsu versus United States, those have been reversed, right? They're no longer the policy of the United States, whereas these two cases for the Border Patrol are the official policy of the United States and are still put into practice every day by the Border Patrol.
Would it be fair to say, I felt like especially during that section of the book, Lewis Powell kind of emerges as one of the great villains of this book. I already hated him for other reasons. Could you talk a little bit about the interesting role that he plays in the outcomes of these decisions, these really legitimately terrible decisions?
Yeah, so the middle section of the book focuses on these three cases. There's a case in 1973, which is Alameda Sanchez versus United States, and then Brignone Ponce in 1975, and Martinez Fuerte in 1976. All of those, Lewis Powell plays this key role in the decisions that the Supreme Court makes. So I kind of use him as a character, and then against him, the same two lawyers who were public defenders in San Diego handled all three of those cases as well that got all the way to the Supreme Court. And so they kind of emerge a little bit as heroes, although they make some suggestions that end up being taken up to kind of allow the racial profiling. So they kind of win for their client, but end up creating, I think, a worse situation overall. But they're really fascinating two figures who saw these kind of outrageous actions by the Border Patrol and decided to do something about it, right? And to take these cases, to continue to appeal these cases to eventually reach the Supreme Court and to adjudicate these questions. Lewis Powell, though, this is the Burger Court in the 1970s, right? So you have to understand that in the context of Richard Nixon, right? Because Nixon won the '68 election on a law and order platform, and one of his key arguments was that the Warren Court, which had had a series of liberal decisions, things like the Miranda rights, MAP versus Ohio, which is the exclusionary clause, right? If evidence is collected in a way that violates proper process, then it can't be used in court, right? That also extended to the states, whereas before that had only been a federal rule. So all of those happened in the 1960s. And so there's this representation that the Supreme Court is too liberal and that there needs to be a conservative revolution. And Nixon has an opportunity in his first 4 years in office to nominate 4 Supreme Court justices. So he can completely remake the court. And he puts in place these law and order justices in order to kind of put in his conservative revolution at the court. And so the expectation was that they were going to make these law and order rulings. But surprisingly, actually, in the first case that I document in the book, which is Alameda Sanchez, this was a case about whether the Border Patrol can search any vehicle in the border zone without any cause whatsoever, which from when the Border Patrol was created in 1924 until 1973, when this case was heard, that was their practice. They could stop and search any vehicle anywhere in the border zone for any reason. And so this case was about whether that was allowed under the Fourth Amendment. And as I document in the book, one of the exciting things now is that all of these Supreme Court justices' records, they've all passed away at this point, and so all of their records are public. They're either at law libraries in the case of Lewis Powell or in the Library of Congress. So you can see now their deliberations behind the scenes of what they were talking about when they were deciding these cases. And in this first case, in Alameda Sanchez, they were poised to say that the Border Patrol could search any vehicle in that 100-mile zone. It was 5-4 with Lewis Powell at first on the 5 saying that it was allowed to do the search. But it turns out he had a law clerk who felt very strongly that this was a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And so Powell put in his vote at the end in June of 1973 in favor of allowing the search. But the law clerk stormed into his office and argued with him and said, you've got to rethink this, right? Give it one more, read my memo one more time and rethink your ruling on this. And so Powell did, and he changed his vote. So he pulled that back and said, you know what, this is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And so the vote switched to 5-4 to say that they can't search any vehicle in the border zone. But that ruling, though, so so we were 2 weeks from saying the Border Patrol could search anyone, anywhere in the border zone. But they pulled that back. But then the next 2 cases after that are both written by Powell as well. And so he's the one that comes up with these facts of articulable suspicion, of reasonable suspicion, that are so broad that the Border Patrol can stop anyone. And then in 1976, he says that the Border Patrol can set up checkpoints anywhere in that 100-mile zone. And in a lot of ways, the checkpoints are maybe the worst part of the story, which we haven't really even talked about yet, in terms of the rights of American citizens, particularly being violated by the Border Patrol. So the Border Patrol operates 114 checkpoints inside the United States. So this is on American highways, interstates, back roads, 25 to 100 miles from the border. The majority of them, 75 or so, are on the southern border, but about 40 of them are on the northern border now. There are not any in Michigan yet, but they do have them in New Hampshire, Maine, and New York. So they're coming your way soon, I would say, probably, with your border there at Detroit and London, Ontario, Windsor. What's the city right over the border?
Yeah, Windsor.
Windsor, okay. Yeah, I got myself flipped around for a second there.
It sounds like you do a lot of traveling. It's okay.
So these checkpoints, they can set these up on roads. They can be permanent, so they can be there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And at these checkpoints, they can stop every single vehicle and ask questions about your immigration status. If they have any reasons that they feel like you're not telling the truth or they want to do more investigation, they can then divert you to a secondary inspection where they can do a lot more in-depth interrogation of you at these places. And so the 1976 ruling, and the reason I say this is also a similarly questionable racial ruling, the Supreme Court said in 1976 that they can use race alone as the only factor in deciding to send a car to secondary inspection. So if you pull up at this checkpoint, you are brown, that can be the reason that they send you for additional questions at these checkpoints. And so people have studied what the Border Patrol does. In Arizona, there was a group, they're called People Helping People out of Arivaca, Arizona, and they observed a checkpoint there for a month straight, 24 hours a day. And they found that at that checkpoint, people of color were 26 times as likely to be sent to secondary inspection as white drivers, and 20 times as likely to be asked for additional identification at the checkpoints. They also found in that whole month that they observed that checkpoint, the Border Patrol did not make a single immigration arrest or drug arrest at that checkpoint in an entire month. And so they have this expansive authority. They're using it deep inside the United States, but the data actually suggests that it's not really very effective for what they're trying to use it for.
You quote a former Border Patrol employee at one point saying something to the effect, of course the Border Patrol is racist. It almost has to be, given the nature of the laws that it is tasked with enforcing. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why did that person come to that conclusion? What is sort of racist about almost the DNA of Border Patrol?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I start the book by telling the early history of the Border Patrol. So your first question was what's surprising about the Border Patrol. Maybe the second thing that's surprising to a lot of people is the U.S. has not always had a Border Patrol, right? People tend to assume that there have always been immigration laws and that there have always been a force there to stop people from entering the United States. But that's just not true, right? The U.S., the first national immigration law in the country was not until 1875. So for the first 100 years or so that the country existed, there were no federal rules about who could enter the country. So it wasn't until Chinese people started to immigrate to the United States that there was the need to have rules about who could come in to the country. So we see the Page Act in 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Up until that point, there were customs officials at ports who would check your possessions, process your paperwork for immigrating to the United States, but there was no one tasked with patrolling in between crossing points. The first people set that role were mounted Chinese inspectors. That was their title in the 1880s, whose job was to ride through border towns, look for people of Chinese appearance, and check their documents. If they didn't have the right documents, to remove them from the United States. So the Border Patrol emerges out of these mounted Chinese inspectors. And the Border Patrol isn't created until 1924. So still less than 100 years ago, the US had a force dedicated to enforcing immigration rules between crossing points. And the reason it was created then is the US passed a massive immigration act in 1924, which is it's often referred to as the National Origins Act, but it set quotas for different countries around the world for the number of people that could immigrate to the United States. Asian immigration was completely banned in that act, and very low quotas were set for like Southern and Eastern Europe, so it has a really dramatic effect on Italian and Greek immigration to the United States. It's a law that's explicitly based on eugenics. The congressional committee that was organizing this, they had an official eugenics officer whose job was to bring eugenics research to the committee so they understood the latest race research in order to create these quotas for who could immigrate to the United States. So that was passed in 1924 in May, and 2 days after it went into effect, the Border Patrol was created. So it was literally established as a racial police force. Its job was to enforce racial entry rules into the United States. And as I document in the early chapters of the book, they used racial profiling as just the matter of fact of how they operated. And the early officers were picked from the Texas Rangers, but also from frontier law enforcement groups and from the mounted Chinese inspectors. When you're writing a book, you look for that kind of telling anecdote that kind of really demonstrates the idea that you're looking for. And for me, it's the name of the very first Border Patrol agent. So the very first person hired by the Border Patrol is a guy that today they refer to him as Jeff Milton, but his actual name is Jefferson Davis Milton. So the first Border Patrol agent was named after the president of the Confederacy. His dad was the Confederate governor of Florida in the Civil War, and he named his son after his good friend Jefferson Davis, right? So that kind of racial origins to policing at the border and to immigration enforcement to me is just kind of perfectly captured in the fact that the first Border Patrol agent was named after the president of the Confederacy.
It's just mind-blowing. Talk about your process of research and reporting for this book. It's one of those books that you read it, talked to a lot of people, he read a lot of documents, he went a lot of places. Man, this guy has a job. He has a day job. How did he do this? How did you do this?
Well, it took a while, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that story of being stopped 5 times in less than an hour, that was in 2011, I think, 2010 maybe, something like that. So, you know, it's been a while that I've been working on this, so it does take some time. But a lot of the documents that I use, particularly the Supreme Court stuff, it's in these libraries, and some of them have them posted online, right? So Lewis Powell's documents, for example, they've digitized his entire record and posted it for free online at Washington Lee's law library. So that is an enormously useful research tool. And then I travel a lot to the borderlands, right? I try to give talks there, and whenever I do, I tackle on an extra week to go do some traveling around and field research at each site. So this is my fourth book about the border in a general sense, right? So I have a previous book about border walls, a book about migrant deaths, and then a book about the race and immigration laws as well.
Yeah, and I wanted, we were talking about white borders, your previous book, just before the event. I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that. You mentioned that there's a strong Michigan connection to that book. So yeah, tell us about White Borders.
Okay. Yeah, so that was so I wrote White Borders, which came out last October, and Nobody is Protected at roughly the same time. And for a while, they were actually the same book. But then I realized it was so much that they eventually ended up splitting up into two separate books. So White Borders tells the history of race and immigration laws in the US. So I kind of alluded to that a little bit already when I was talking about the Chinese Exclusion Acts and the 1924 Immigration Act. And so that book, though, continues all the way through the Trump presidency, right? And thinking about the types of extreme anti-immigrant rules that the Trump presidency was putting in place. And as I was working on that book, I kind of found this villain, really, for the book, this guy named John Tansen, who has been called the most influential American that most people have never heard of. And so John Tansen in the 1960s, while he was a student at Michigan State University, got a bee in his bonnet about population growth. And he was particularly influenced by Paul Ehrlich in the late 1960s with the idea of the population bomb. In the 1970s, while John Tansen was an ophthalmologist in Petoskey, Michigan, where he lived his entire life, he became convinced that population growth was a problem, but more of a problem was immigration to the United States from places where population was exploding. And so in the 1970s, he set out on this mission to reduce the amount of immigration to the United States. And the whole time he was working as a full-time ophthalmologist in upstate Michigan, he also founded over a dozen anti-immigrant groups, groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA. Maybe you haven't heard of any of these groups, but you have definitely seen their information online and in the language of Donald Trump, because a lot of Donald Trump's advisors kind of cut their teeth in these groups founded by John Tansen. So Stephen Miller, for example, is closely tied to the Center for Immigration Studies. He gave a keynote speech at their national conference like a week before Donald Trump started his presidential campaign. And I should have mentioned somewhere in that long talk about John Tansen that he also has all kinds of ties to white supremacist groups. So John Tansen's papers are also available, and they're in fact here in Ann Arbor at the Bentley Historical Library, just on the kind of that other section of the University of Michigan campus. So while I was working on that book, I spent several days delving through those papers, and a lot of people have posted those online as well now. But kind of throughout his career, he was putting forward a public face of kind of a moderate anti-immigrant group and founding all of these important organizations at the same time that he was corresponding privately with prominent white supremacists. By the early 2000s, the Southern Poverty Law Center was aware of him, and many of those groups are designated as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. But nevertheless, they've kind of been folded into the mainstream of Republican thought these days. And so a lot of key figures on the right are fellows at these organizations or worked there before joining the Trump administration. in that book, I document, I think there were 16 people who went from working at one of these hate groups to becoming officials in either the Department of Justice or the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration, which it's just kind of outrageous to even think that you can do that. And the way, one last thing about John Tansen, the way that he was able to do this, how was he able to get all of this put together? In the 1980s, he became a close associate of this lady named Cordelia Scaife May, who was an heir of the Mellon money. In the 1990s, she was the richest woman in the United States, and she left all of her money to John Tansen's anti-immigrant foundations. So there's a group called the Colcom Foundation, which is based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which has today almost $500 million in assets, and their entire purpose is to fund the anti-immigrant right. So there's this huge trove of money for that. So I tell all those stories in my book, White Borders, and then this book is kind of about how the Border Patrol enforces these laws that these anti-immigrant and white supremacist groups have been arguing for such a long time. So in terms of what is the racist origins of the Border Patrol, I mean, it was founded as a racial police force. The entire premise of immigration restrictions to the United States is about racial exclusion. It's about protecting an idea of a white country. And so as that Border Patrol agent, her name is Jen Budd, says, of course they operate in a racist way, right? Their entire purpose is racial policing. So they were founded as a racial police force. They use racial profiling. They're legally allowed to do it. It is fundamentally about racial exclusion.
My last question kind of has two sides to it. So on the one hand, you know, having done this work, having written these books, if you had, how do I put this, the Joe Biden of the last 6 weeks or so, who is clearly on some really good vitamins and suddenly has a great deal of urgency to do useful things after a couple of years of, frankly, terrifying inaction. You know, what would you be asking him to do? And then those of us who are not Joe Biden, you know, those of us who are just regular people or who are activists. I mean, what does sort of the saner side of power need to be doing? Well, it can. And then what do ordinary people need to be doing to put enough pressure on this system to destroy it?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is, unfortunately, anti-immigrant policies in the US are generally fairly bipartisan. If you look at who puts these things in place and who keeps them in place, there isn't really a better one side or the other on that, right? I mean, if you look at when was the Border Patrol expanded dramatically, it was the 1990s when Clinton was in office, right? When did the Department of Justice review racial profiling for the Border Patrol? It was in 2014. It was the Obama Justice Administration, right? Department of Justice. Eric Holder was the Attorney General at the time.
Didn't some of the really famous, like, viral images of children in cages actually come from the Obama period as well?
Yeah, they were. They were prior to the...
People used to call him the deporter-in-chief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and still that title is accurate. More people were deported during the Obama administration than any other administration in the history of the U.S. government. That's part of... that's a whole side story about why that's a data point particularly. But yeah, I mean, Obama and Biden and Hillary Clinton all voted for the border wall in 2006 when the U.S. first started building the border wall. So yeah, unfortunately, it's a bipartisan thing. But okay, if I did have a magic wand and I could drop into the Biden administration and have them do a few things, you know, leaving aside that I would say we don't even need a border patrol, right? But if we're trying to be more practical, well, the first thing is the 100-mile zone, right? So we talked about that and we started with that idea. But there's no legislation that says that that's what the Border Patrol's zone has to be. Instead, the legislation says it's a 1946 revision to the Border Patrol's authorization that says they can operate a reasonable distance from the border. In 1947, the Department of Justice, at the time the Border Patrol was in the Department of Justice, interpreted that as within 100 miles of borders and coastlines. So it's not legislated, right? Instead, it's an administrative decision. So the Department of Homeland Security could revisit that today, right? They could say, you know what, we don't want to use that interpretation anymore. We're going to interpret it as 5 miles from the border, for example. And that alone could have an enormous impact on a lot of the things that I talk about in this book. First of all, if you're interested in enforcement, almost 60% of the Border Patrol's apprehensions happen within 1 mile of the border, right? So you're still doing the apprehension purpose if that's what you want to do. But it would mean that those checkpoints that we talked about would be removed, right? Because they're all 25 to 100 miles from the border, where the Border Patrol, and in those checkpoints, they've stopped 250 million vehicles in the last 5 years, right? So we're talking about a huge number of vehicles passing through these checkpoints. But also migrant deaths would immediately be reduced by moving the border zone closer to the border. Because the majority of people who die in the border zone don't die crossing the actual line. Instead, it's when people have to trek 60 or 70 miles through the desert to get around these checkpoints, right, that you see the migrant deaths. Or get in the back of a trailer outside of San Antonio, right, like the 50 people who died a couple of months ago, right? The reason they're doing that is because of that vast size of the border zone. So reducing the border zone to within a much closer distance to the border would get rid of a lot of the worst aspects of what the Border Patrol is doing today. Wouldn't solve all of them. I would still say it's a racial police force, but the impacts would be far less, right? So if the Biden administration did one thing, that would be the thing I would recommend.
And then what should the rest of us be doing to put pressure toward that kind of outcome, or toward the abolition of the racial police force that we don't need?
I mean, that's a big question, right? But I think the Congress needs to hear about these things, right? Because I think what often happens for Democrats in Congress is that when they hear from people, immigration typically isn't the first thing that they hear from, right? They tend to hear about jobs. They tend to hear about health care, right? Child care, family leave, things like that, that are major issues on the left. So people on the left are in favor of more immigration, would like the Border Patrol not to be so violent, but that tends to not be the first issue, right? So when Democrats get into office, they tend to just maintain border and security type stuff, and turn their attention elsewhere, like you were kind of discussing. And the result of that is that kind of continuing ratcheting up. So, I would say raise these issues, make it clear to your congressional representatives that you're worried about this erosion of the Fourth Amendment and the expansion of the Border Patrol into the interior of the United States.
It's a climate justice issue too, isn't it? I mean, we have made the parts of the world uninhabitable through CO2 emissions. I mean, we have to be more willing to accept and accommodate people from ecologically distressed parts of the world. Well, shall we do Q&A?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. So we're going to do Q&A. We've got time for a few questions, so I will actually go around with the mic to anyone who has a question, just so we can all hear each other. And then after that, Reece will be signing books, and you can pick up a book from Literati. So does anybody have a question?
Thank you so much. This book sounds wonderful, and I can't wait to read it, and I'm so grateful for your research. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, on the other border, and we would often see, as people were coming out of high schools and middle schools, temporary border checkpoints that were set up right outside of school to catch children and their parents. And I'm wondering if that kind of it's different than those permanent places that you have to drive through to get anywhere in certain parts of Texas from one place to another. But is there a different legal jurisdiction for those temporary checkpoints? And is there anything in all of this that protects the rights of children at all? I mean, I know we've all seen the pictures of the children in the cages, and we know the terrible things that have happened to unaccompanied minors, but in terms of what you were mentioning before about how these checkpoints violate the rights of U.S. citizens, is there anything in place at all that provides any measure of protection against targeting racialized U.S. citizens who are children?
I mean, the short answer is no, there's not a lot in place, right? I mean, that's what they can do. But there are some lawsuits happening right now about these checkpoints. There's a case in New Hampshire, which is Droniac versus Customs and Border Protection, which was the Border Patrol had set up a checkpoint 90 miles from the Canadian border over I think it was Labor Day weekend, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And over a 36-hour period, they did these checks at this checkpoint, and they found no one who had crossed the Canadian border without documents, but they did find a lot of drugs, and often small amounts of drugs. And so the case there is arguing that the way that they're doing these checkpoints violates the Supreme Court's kind of narrow parameters of why they can do the checkpoints. So if you look at the 1976 case, it says they can do the checkpoints, but for immigration purposes only, and that it's not a general policing checkpoint. And then in the year 2000, the Supreme Court heard another case about police checkpoints. It's Edmonds versus City of Indianapolis, not a Border Patrol case, just a general police checkpoint case. But that case also said that you can't set up general checkpoints, right? That your checkpoints have to have a specific purpose, and that they need to be narrowly defined for that purpose, like a drunk driving checkpoint, right? That's temporary for drunk driving purposes, not just to check vehicles generally for other things. But the Border Patrol does seem to be doing just general checkpoints. And so we see that with the drugs. So the checkpoints in the interior of the United States are not effective for immigration purposes. The Border Patrol spends about 10% of their staff time at these interior checkpoints, but they only account for something like 2.5% of their apprehensions. So they're not cost effective in that sense, but they do make a good number of drug arrests at the checkpoints. But if you look at who's getting arrested, 91% of the people who are cited for a drug violation at an interior checkpoint are American citizens. And 50% of those people have less than an ounce of marijuana, which in many of the states where they're operating is legal to have that amount of marijuana. And almost all of those people hadn't left the United States, right? They're driving from one U.S. city to another U.S. city. This has affected a number of celebrities, Willie Nelson, Snoop Dogg, Nelly, Fiona Apple, Lil Wayne. All of them have been cited for drug possession at an interior Border Patrol checkpoint while in a tour bus, right? Driving from one city to another inside the United States. So I think there is this avenue to question these checkpoints based on that previous Supreme Court ruling in City of Indianapolis versus Edmond, to say that they're doing a lot of things beyond what they're supposed to be doing. A couple more last things on that topic. They also do dirty bomb checks at these checkpoints. So they have radiation sensors for vehicles that pass through. About a decade ago, the former governor of Arizona, who was 91 years old at the time, had just gotten a radiation therapy for cancer, and it set off the sensor at one of these interior checkpoints, and he had to stand outside for almost an hour in the hot sun while they checked his vehicle because of that. They also, if you drive through these checkpoints, they put your license plate into a DEA database, and it stays there for 15 years after you went through that checkpoint. So there are a whole series of ways that the checkpoints are being used beyond that original immigration purpose. I could talk a lot more about that, but they definitely do what you're saying, which is place these tactical checkpoints in very specific places to target families. Or there are also examples of local police doing like a drunk driving checkpoint, but doing it for an immigration purpose with a plan to turn people over to, in this case, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. There was some geographers that I know did a study in North Carolina where they mapped when and where the local police were doing drunk driving checkpoints near Durham, North Carolina. And they tended to do those at 5:30 to 7:30 in the morning in front of trailer parks, right? And so they were essentially catching Mexican laborers going to work in the morning, right? And miraculously, they weren't finding a lot of drunk drivers, but they were finding a lot of immigration violations at these checkpoints they were setting up. So there are lots of examples of exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, do we have another question?
Would you like to talk about the broader problem of immigration policy in the U.S.? I keep hearing on news and everywhere, immigration policy is a mess. Would you like to talk about what might help straighten that out? And how any change could be made without Republicans crying, oh, you're weak on crime, rapists, murderers, diseased people, etc.?
Yeah, well, they're going to say that no matter what, right? Because Biden has done nothing on immigration. He's been really terrible on that policy-wise. But nevertheless, that's all they've talked about is open border policies, right, at the border. Even though he's kept in place Title 42, he's kept in place Remain in Mexico, even when he could have pulled it back, right? So he's maintained a lot of these kind of extreme Trump-era policies, even when he could have undone those. So I think no matter what the Democrats do, they're going to get called open borders advocates. So maybe they should just be open borders advocates, right? And do these things that they're being accused of. So what are the problems with immigration policy? I mean, I think the biggest problem is that it's really difficult to immigrate to the United States right now. There are all kinds of challenges to legally coming to the country, right? And so because it's so difficult to legally come, the only option for many people is to go through these other means to do that. Similarly, the U.S. needs to have a much better and broader policy for asylum seekers and refugees, right? So the Biden administration, they publicly set a cap of 100,000 refugee admissions this year, but they didn't make any effort to actually fill that, right? And so I think that we're going to end up with like 20,000 refugee admissions this year, which is below the Trump administration's first couple years in office, right? So it's about, I think, like Phil mentioned, the world is seeing a lot of displacements globally, right? I mean, if you look at the next 30 to 40 years, there are going to be people displaced because of climate change, because of environmental change, because of conflict. There are going to be more people on the move, right? And so there are essentially two options. One is to put in place mechanisms now to have people be able to move safely and humanely, or to build walls and spend a lot more money on border patrols and make it a deadly thing, right? And have a lot more migrant deaths. And right now we've kind of gone with that route so far. We're spending the money into security instead of putting the money into programs for safe travel and for job training when people arrive, right? And so my recommendation would be to do more of that, right? Instead of spending money on violence, spend the money on training, spend the money on safe ways for people to migrate, because they're going to migrate either way, right? And so the question is, what sort of welcome do we want to provide for them? And just a final side note on that, there's a ton of research in economics about the impacts of immigration on receiving countries, and it's uniformly positive. The more people who migrate to a country, the more it benefits the country that are receiving those migrants, right? So they increase wages, they benefit the economy, they contribute to the society. So there's no economic case against additional immigration, right? So it benefits the country to have more immigrants. Really, it's a moral issue too, right, of creating safe and humane ways for people to do that.
And I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay, I just had two things. Reece. I had first a thought about what you were saying about people being stopped for dirty bombs. Just a little anecdote about a geology professor at U of M, Don Pecor, was stopped years ago because of a rock he had found. He was bringing back, and it happened to have a little chunk of radioactive material in it, which he didn't even realize. That's not why he had it. He had it for some other reason. But he was stopped, and it was over 5 hours. He was at the border and no one could figure out exactly what was wrong. And he kept saying, I don't have a bomb. I don't have any radiation. And they finally figured out that there was a tiny little piece of this rock that he was bringing back for research purposes that had completely, delayed him. But that's just a little side anecdote. My question is about your title. And when I was actually talking to Don Pecor's son, who was interested in coming, because his brother-in-law is a border agent, and he himself is, very much kind of on the, I think he would be very sympathetic to all of your arguments, but he said, I want to bring my brother-in-law. But now I saw the title, and I know I won't be able to get him to come, seeing the title of this book. How can I talk to him about this? And so my question is kind of that. How have you been able to start this conversation with people, border agents or other people, sympathetic or kind of, who might initially be resistant to these ideas or not want to have this conversation? How would you start the conversation with people without sort of getting their hackles up to say, we need Border Patrol or we need reform? What is your to begin this conversation with people who are not sympathetic to the politics? I think that I didn't know how to answer him and say, no, come, bring your brother. But I was curious how you might answer that. If you've faced this already, people certainly push back against some of this information, but data is data. But how would you begin the conversation to get people to even listen, to say, well, look at some of the information?
Yeah. I think with this particular topic, and although I think all humans have equal rights and we should respect everyone's rights to freedom of movement, I think the in on this particular topic is to appeal to people's constitutional rights, right? Because American citizens' rights are being violated by this, right? Who is being stopped at these internal checkpoints? It's American citizens who are getting cited for this. It's American citizens who are being found with 1 ounce of marijuana, not even getting a drug charge, but having their vehicle seized, right? Because of civil asset forfeiture laws, right? For driving through a Border Patrol checkpoint on an American highway, right? So I think the way to appeal to someone who wouldn't ordinarily be sympathetic to immigration issues is to focus on that impact that it's having on Americans, right? On American citizens' rights inside the United States, right? We're not talking about things happening at the borderline. We're not talking about things outside of the United States. We're talking about American citizens 100 miles from the border. Right now, we are in this border zone, right? So the Border Patrol could set up a checkpoint outside on the street right now and stop every single vehicle and ask them questions, right? So it doesn't just impact immigrants. On the title, though, I thought you were going to ask actually about the first part of the title, which we didn't actually talk about, so maybe I'll just really quickly say where that comes from, right? So the first title of the book is Nobody is Protected, and that's actually a quote from Thurgood Marshall during the Supreme Court hearings on the first of these cases. And so he was asking questions of the government lawyer who was defending the ability of the Border Patrol at that point to search any vehicle in that 100-mile zone. And so he asked a series of hypothetical questions, right? He's like, okay, could you stop my vehicle and search it in the border zone? And the lawyer said, yeah. And then he said, so, okay, could you stop the President of the United States and search his vehicle in the border zone? And the lawyer pauses for a second and he's like, yeah, we can. And so at that point, Thurgood Marshall says, nobody is protected. And I think that's the truth.
I was just going to ask, what's the next topic for your next area of study? Or continuation of study, probably.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that next topic is. I mean, so I've got the 4 books now kind of looking at these immigration topics on walls, on migrant deaths, on race and immigration, and then now on the Border Patrol. And so I'm trying to think of exactly what that next project should be. I'm really interested in the impact that borders have on global governance, because my sense is that a lot of the issues that we're facing in the world today are increasingly global issues, right? So the environment is global, right? Climate change is happening globally, but we are trying to manage that by a state-by-state, country-by-country solution to it, right? And so the scale of the problem doesn't match the scale of solutions that we can propose, right? And so it's a disjuncture caused by borders. Similarly, issues like immigration, right? Immigration is something that is a global phenomenon of people migrating and moving around the world, but we manage that on this country-by-country basis, and it creates this inability to deal with this issue that's affecting the entire Earth. And so I feel like I want to write a book that kind of tries to get at that disconnect between the problems that we're seeing at a global level and the scale of the solutions that we can come up that are constrained by borders.
So we want to end here for the evening, but thank you so much, Reece and Phil, for this wonderful talk. And thank you again to Literati. There are some books out for sale if you would like to pick one up, and Reece can sign over here. So thank you so much.